grab your water and find your nearest air conditioning unit because it's hot, hot, hot. And that's probably all you've heard anyone talking about this week, as 100 million Americans endure extreme heat with dangerous conditions covering the Midwest and eastern United States. Weather forecasters say temperatures are expected to spike over 100 degrees in the Washington, D.C. area this weekend, along with numbers approaching 100 degrees in New York and New England.
Meteorologists say these areas are under a heat dome, which is caused by a high-pressure system in the Earth's upper atmosphere that compresses the air beneath it, making it expand into a dome shape and prevents cool air from getting into the regions below. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, categorizes extreme heat as a 2 to 3 day or longer period of temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the people delivering the bad news are feeling the effects of the heat. Meteorologists are finding themselves caught in the political crosshairs of the climate debate. Joining us now to discuss is Christopher Gloninger. Christopher, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Let's start with a little bit about what is behind the high temperatures we've been seeing lately, as well as what people can do to try to stay cool.
This heat also made worse by climate change, right? We are seeing 2 record high temperatures that occur in this country for every 1 record cold. So it's outpacing, record heat is outpacing record cold by 2 to 1. This heat wave in particular, about 3 to 5 times more likely because of climate change than pre-industrial revolution when we had less carbon emissions. How do we know this? Well, atmospheric and climate scientists have more data to prove that humans are influencing climate change than medical doctors are that smoking causes cancer, which is really a remarkable statistic. But we have the data, we have the science and the facts to prove that, yes, in fact, this heat, even though it's summer, is made worse by climate change. Now, Amber, the other thing that's concerning is in environmental justice communities, for example, it's difficult to keep cool. And that's how climate change is affecting those communities harder. When you have an energy burden, which is how much of your take-home pay goes into cooling costs, when that number is 6% or higher, well, that's what we consider an energy burden. When you have to make those difficult decisions between putting food on the table, picking up a prescription that you might need for a pre-existing condition, and keeping cool, it's very dangerous. And it's also a vicious cycle, right? Because there's probably nothing more that sucks power than HVAC, window units to keep cool, and it kind of adds to the problem that is climate change.
So you spent about 18 years at 7 different stations across 5 states as a meteorologist, and then you transitioned into climate science. When you were a meteorologist, using your tools, it is a science, to determine what the weather is, what the trends are, and make predictions, did you notice trends of summers getting hotter or heat waves? What inspired you to go into climate science?
I wanted to do more than what I was doing. It was Hurricane Harvey when I worked for NBC. I worked in Boston, and I was part of the task force that would go and help other stations across the country cover hurricanes and provide live coverage. And it was Harvey that really made me make the push with station management to cover climate change on a weekly basis. 60 inches of rain, no matter what we did to stay dry, water got in through the rain jackets, through our rain boots, our waterproof pants. It found a way in, a huge amount of rain, and this has been repeated time after time after time. Storms have more moisture. As the atmosphere warms, every degree of warming, it holds 4% more moisture. So it start to take that data and apply it to my weathercast, show how the weather is changing, and show the difference between weather and climate, right? It's not 90 degrees one day, 70 the next. That is weather. 1 degree changes on a global scale is what's concerning, and that is what is climate change. But even in 2012, when I covered Hurricane Sandy in New York City, I started incorporating some, at least, information, nuggets of information about climate change, but then really made a push starting in 2017, and that propelled me to my job in Iowa, where I was brought on at first to talk about climate change until there was significant pushback, and then I was told not to cover it.
So I'm curious to get a little bit more of your perspective on climate justice and what could help these families have less prohibitively expensive energy, because we know that there are more cold-related deaths than heat-related deaths, and a lot of people rely on cheap and abundant fossil fuels in order to both heat and cool their homes. So how are people supposed to balance addressing climate change allegedly driving weather-related trends, while also making sure that they're able to afford basic energy costs for their home.
That's why when people ask me what can I do about climate change, I try to give them advice that is tangible to everyone and is you're able to do no matter your income situation, right? Because for some people, getting solar, buying an EV is cost prohibitive. Even though there are incentives, it's still expensive. But you have to get involved and talk about it. And when there is a conversation around the issue, and especially when you're tying in environmental justice communities, then that kind of propels action. And for these communities, it's not just heating and cooling costs. You're talking about areas that are the pollution sources, not just of exhaust, but truly the CO2 emissions really are rooted in these communities where there's very little green space to protect people from that blazing sun that we have during the summer. So it's increasing green space. It's finding ways to cut air quality sources, poor air quality sources in these communities, and work with residents in understanding climate literacy and making opportunities available to them to try to find ways to lower those energy costs by working with landlords to better insulate and find more cooling systems that are energy efficient or can work better. Because at the end of the day, it's going to cost the landlords if they're paying the money for heating and cooling costs. It costs them less if you have a more energy efficient system. And if it's the tenant that is in an environmental justice community that's paying those prices, well, in that case, it works out for them too, because it will lower their costs in the long run, day to day.
Chris, your story is a fascinating one, getting pushback around covering the climate as a meteorologist and a scientist at a time when you were in Iowa, and Iowa is a place that I've lived. I'm flying back to Iowa when I leave DC. And when I was there during the 2020 election, we had this barnstorm where we invited people in the town of Clarinda to come and talk about climate change and what our politicians can do about it and what the Green New Deal really is. And we packed the House with Republicans and Democrats. And while climate is considered a political issue today, a lot of the people in Iowa, because they're farmers, they're experiencing droughts and record high temperatures, it's also their livelihood. So I'm really fascinated that you got pushback when you were at KCCI, and I want to hear more about how you feel when science gets political.
It's unfortunate, it really is, because as I mentioned at the top of the segment, we have more evidence that climate change is made worse by humans, caused by humans, than doctors have that smoking causes cancer. And you think about that stat, of course, if you talk to somebody on the street, they would say, yeah, smoking is unhealthy. While it is, we have more evidence about climate change and that human component. What I did, and I think what was missed in my story when it first happened, was I did find a way to connect with people on the other side of the political spectrum that may not be climate activists or may not be concerned about climate change, because at the end of the day, it comes down to money, and that is really a conservative principle. And when I moved from Boston to Iowa, we went from a house that was half the size to one double the size. Our cooling and heating costs went down substantially because they were powered by wind, the third biggest wind producer in the country, and the energy was dirt cheap. It made sense. That was true energy independence. When you have energy being produced in your own backyard, and for farmers, for example, they were getting $10,000 to $15,000 per turbine in land leases. So it made sense. Also, when it comes to fiscal responsibility, we're shelling out billions on these disasters that are happening that are going unmitigated, and we're not adapting to climate change. For every dollar spent on mitigation and adaptation, you get $7 back in return in recovery costs. So if you think about that, that's fiscally responsible to take action now. And true energy independence is producing your own energy and not relying on foreign sources. So those two things resonated with that audience, and showing them the data just helped. That was the cherry on top of the pie there. And again, that was lost in the messaging when my news broke last year that I was leaving. But I did find a formula, and with the outpouring of support, with hundreds of emails, dozens of cards, even from conservative towns like Clarinda, Iowa, people supported it. And I think that is where my former station really missed the mark. They had good intention of bringing me on to do this, but then when there was a loud pushback from a small minority, they essentially caved, unfortunately.
How do we put the current heat wave in context with historical heat waves? For example, the EPA says that long-term records show that heat waves in the 1930s were the most severe, even to this day in American history. Of course, we know the history of the Dust Bowl. How does what we're experiencing now compare to things like that?
And that was usually applied in a misinformation setting, which that is 100% accurate. There are some misconceptions and there's a breakdown in communication and understanding that was also because of poor agricultural practices, right? And when the land was dry land and dry air heats up a lot more efficiently. But if you look at the global scale of what happened during the 1930s, when we were having our Dust Bowl, the rest of the world was seeing a relatively stable climate. And that is the difference between the heat we're seeing now, which is far-reaching, which is encompassing, again, a large part of the world at the same exact time. That's the concerning trend that we're starting to see, right? Even if you look at the statistical average, the long-term average, we did have years that spiked above the norm, but we've had 526 plus consecutive months where the global average temperatures have been above average. That has never happened in recorded history. That isn't just some, this isn't just some small little deviation. This is a true trend, which is essentially climate change in a nutshell. These longer term trends that we're seeing, not just a period in time where one part of the world, one part of the country was abnormally hot.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, because I'm curious, what is the explanation for why in hotter areas the temperature is increasing at a slower rate than in areas with lower temperatures generally?
That's a great question. And there are places in the Southeast, for example, that was this warming hole that happened in parts of Georgia that were going against the trend of seeing temperatures that were going up over time. And one of the reasons why is land use changed. And now that we're seeing more industry down there, more development in parts of Georgia that we're not keeping up pace with the warming that we're seeing across the rest of the country. That area, for example, is finally starting to see the signs that, in fact, the atmosphere is warming, those global average temperatures are climbing. So there are these anomalies, but you really need to investigate the why, right? And when you're already hot, it's difficult to kind of move that benchmark even higher, right? So it's the mid-latitudes that are seeing the dramatic warming, and that's what we're going to start to see ramp up. But it's the areas that there's a little bit more nuance to that situation that we are starting to see warming, but for a long time, we didn't see as dramatic of warming in those parts of the country.
Chris Gloninger, thank you so much for coming on and breaking this down with us, and everyone stay cool.
Thanks.